Can Falcons kicker Younghoe Koo get it back, or should the team cut bait and move on?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. Knowles, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are doing a deep dive into kicking. And I know it's Combine Week, and you're like, oh, why are we talking about kicking? We should be talking about these Combine players. Well, the kickers are actually the first people to hit the field on Wednesday at the scouting combine. So it is a little topical, but we did the keep versus cut episode last week talking about several Falcon players, Grady Jarrett, Caleb McGarrett. I wanted to do Younghoe Koo, but I also wanted to have a little bit more of an informed opinion about kicking, right? And we brought on a guest, Alex Katson, and unfortunately Alex wasn't on before we did that episode. So, we're moving it to this week. And, did we get into that conversation about Koo's issues last year and whether or not the Falcons should keep or cut him? And so at the end of today's episode, after we listen to Alex give his perspective on that, you'll get my perspective on that decision on whether or not the Falcons should keep or cut Koo. But without further ado, let's get into that conversation with Alex Katson, our resident kicking guru, right now. All right, everyone, back with an illustrious guest. He is Alex Katson, who writes for so many different entities and covers so many different topics. I don't even know what to plug when it comes to what he does. But if there is a topic when it comes to the sport of football, Alex probably has written about it. But today we will be talking specifically about that very niche topic, which is kicking, which very few people talk about when it comes to the NFL. And I don't think NFL teams really have a good grasp of it. They're just kind of like looking at a box score and saying, who had the highest field goal percentage? That's a good kicker, and no in-depth in it. But we're going to be talking about Younghoe Koo, who is a player that has been discussed in Atlanta coming off of a struggling 2024 season, has a $5.5 million cap hit. The Falcons could save money by cutting him, saving $3 million. And so I want to have an informed conversation about whether or not the Falcons are potentially going to move on from Younghoe Koo and get Alex's thoughts on, pros, cons of that. But Alex, my friend, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Very excited to talk about kicking, which has sort of become my beat over the last few months, kind of surprisingly to me as well as everyone else, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm a huge nerd about specialists, so it's been a fun experience to get to do all that sort of stuff with all these kickers that sort of struggled. We kind of had a paradigm shift a little bit in the league this year with guys like Tucker and Younghoe Koo and, everyone else. Jake Elliott struggled a little bit during this year. Evan McPherson went on IR. So a lot of change in the kicker world this year. So kind of a good time to acquire that reputation for me.
Yeah. So when it comes to Younghoe Koo, he struggled this year, had, a career low, not counting his 1 year with the Chargers. We don't count that year, but a career low with Atlanta, connecting on just 74% of his field goals after nearly hitting about 90% in the previous 5 seasons in Atlanta. And one of the things I've sort of talked about on Locked On Falcons, which is like when you do the math, like it's basically he missed like 4 more kicks than usual this year, and like 2 of those were blocked. And so it's not nearly as, or no, I think he missed 6 more kicks than usual. 2 of those were blocked. So it's 4 more kicks than usual. And so it's not nearly as bad a number when you just sort of look at the 74% at face value. But one of the things that has been talked about quite a bit and some of the issues that Younghoe Koo faced this past year was sort of the tweaking he's done with his kicking stance. He has a very unorthodox kicking stance relative to most kickers in the NFL, where it's kind of a straight onward sort of kicking stance. And the way that Younghoe Koo has explained it in the past is that allows him to get a little bit more control and consistency. And I think for me, and I'm curious, Alex, what your thoughts are on this, if you've done any homework on this, but like I think the general perception is that he changed his kicking stance this year, where to me, this is more just an evolution of slight tweaking a kicking stance that he's had from my eyes since 2022. But I'm very curious, what are your thoughts on the evolution of Younghoe Koo's kicking stance, whether that's part of the contribution in terms of his struggles and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think obviously when you watch Koo's stance, he's the most straight on kicker in the league. It's a very narrow approach to the ball. And like you mentioned, he has said in interviews that he feels like that gives him better control over where the ball is going to fly. He kind of likens it to hitting a golf ball with a wedge instead of an iron, right? Where you're looking to get that control, you have a little bit more surface area that you can hit the ball with. And I think that you're right. It is sort of been an evolution where he's gotten a little bit more narrow every single year, and he's approached that a little bit differently every year. But with that also comes like a very narrow precision window to hit the ball, because when you approach it from that narrowly, you are very prone to catching your foot on the ground as you're kicking the ball because you're kicking it a little bit straight on. It's kind of the same way where, like, when you were a kid and you played soccer, your coaches always told you not to toe kick the ball, right? Both because, like, it's going to smash your toes in, but also because if you're trying to get under it to get any distance on it, you're probably going to catch your leg on the ground, and that's going to kind of over the course of multiple reps, that's going to cause a lot of tension in your kind of entire leg chain process. And I think that a lot of that has to do, right? I think a lot of that leads to the injury that Koo ended up having that put him on IR in week 15. I talked to a couple of people about him kind of over the last few months. And one person that I talked to actually mentioned that, like, he thinks that Koo's injury didn't actually happen until week 15 where he went on IR. Obviously, he was kind of in and out of the lineup for a couple weeks before that. But he thinks that that injury probably actually cropped up probably in like week 8, right? Like way earlier in the season than it was ever reported or it was ever like mentioned of like he's dealing with something, right? Because you have to be so precise. Like it's down to like a tenth of a second that you have to hit that ball. Otherwise, you're going to catch your leg, even just the tiniest bit, on the ground, right? And as you do that over and over and over again, that's going to kind of cause repeated tension in your quad that if you haven't been kicking like that this whole time, which again, Koo's adjustment this year, I think was a more extreme adjustment that we've seen recently, but certainly still an evolution of that same process, right? But that extreme change like that makes it so that like his leg process is not necessarily as attuned to kicking that straight on. And so when you catch your leg like that a little bit, it's going to tear a little bit at the quad muscles that you have there. And then over the course of doing that, 8, 10, 100 times, you're going to end up with quad injuries. And that's what happened to him this season.
So when you look at Koo, is this something that I guess it boils down is this something that he's just going to have to work through, or has he just kind of broken himself with sort of this evolution? What we're talking about is basically, can he get back to where he was prior? I mean, even starting this season, he was very efficient and whatnot. And is this something that he can get back to what he was the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season, where he was hitting connecting on over 90% of his kicks, and that is something that we can expect moving forward? Or is this style, or in what you're talking about, something that is kind of, it just kind of break him, and it's going to lead to more issues like this moving forward, in your humble opinion?
I think it is fixable. I think, again, like you pointed to the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season where he was super consistent. He was the Younghoe Koo that we all know, right? And I think when you look at the way that he came about this process, he said in interviews before that like he does work with kicking coaches in the off seasons, but this new motion that he has was something that he completely reverse engineered himself, where basically he found a point of contact on the ball that he really liked, and then he engineered a motion backwards out of that so that he had the most consistent point that he hit the ball every time. And I think that aspect of it does make a lot of sense, right? Because for a guy like that who's struggled historically a little bit with his balls spraying a little bit more, right? You do want to find that consistent contact point because that's going to hone in the accuracy a little bit. And so I get what he's trying to do in that respect. But when you self teach that motion and you reverse engineer that motion, right? There's a lot of biomechanical stuff that you may not be considering, even for like a guy who's been an NFL kicker for, 8-9 years at this point and has been a kicker since he was a teenager, right? There's a lot of biomechanical stuff that might just be like we talked about with the quad, right? And so I think if you go back this offseason and you work with a guy like John Carney, who he's worked with in the past, who's a renowned kicking coach, was a renowned NFL kicker when he played, I think that it is fixable because I think you can work on finding a way to either strengthen that quad where it's going to be less of an issue. You can work on tweaking that motion just a little bit so that you're not at as much of a risk of kind of raking your foot against the ground before you hit the ball as you approach it. I think that it is fixable. Whether or not the Falcons give him that opportunity, I think is a different question. Obviously, kickers have a notoriously short leash in the NFL. I do kind of expect that the Falcons will bring in some competition this year, probably in the form of a UDFA signing after the draft. But I would anticipate that Koo probably still has the inside track on winning that job, at least in week 1 of next season.
Yeah, that's been the general expectation for me, where I feel like, given the concerns, I don't think you can just go into next season trusting, oh, Koo's definitely going to get it back. I think you do need to bring in another option, a plan B option, in the event that those struggles do continue. But now that we have a better handle on those issues that Koo has to work through, we'll get Alex's answer on whether or not it's ultimately worth the Falcons to keep him, coming up on today's Locked On Falcons. Alex, I appreciate your insight into this because, the question that other people have sort of phrased it, where it's like, if Koo is potentially broken, it's the idea of, cutting him a year too early versus a year too late. And if they go into this season, those kicking struggles continue, you're going to be having that conversation of, man, we should have probably moved on from Younghoe Koo this offseason and got that party started. Now, I know, as very much a pro Younghoe Koo guy here on Locked On Falcons, and I know you are also a big fan of Younghoe Koo, we probably don't have the most unbiased opinion on what the Falcons should do. But I guess, knowing, based off of what we've discussed so far today, do you think it is worthwhile for the Falcons to bring back Younghoe Koo this season?
I think it is. I think with any kicker like this, Younghoe Koo is only going to be 31 this season, which in NFL kicker terms is pretty young still, because the top end guys kick until they're 35, 36, 40 at sometimes. And so I think that you lean on the historical precedent that Koo has set with the Falcons, especially, right? Where he has been one of the league's best kickers to this point. And 2024 was just a down year. And most kickers have a year where they have a down year. And a lot of times it is because of an injury like this. But I think that it being a quad injury and not being like a hip or an ankle or something like that, I think that actually lends itself very well to a recovery and a bounce back season versus like a hip injury, where a lot of the time those are like debilitating injuries for kickers that end careers. I get that, like, it's a large cap number for a kicker, right? $5.5 million is expensive for a kicker, but I think that the beauty of bringing in maybe a UDFA type to compete this training camp, right, is that even if Koo wins that job, that kicker that loses may not necessarily get picked up right away. And so if you want to give him a short leash in the regular season, right, and say like, well, you've won this competition, let's see how the first couple of weeks of actual game action go, and then he performs poorly, I think you can still pull the plug and you can still salvage it, right? You can still say like, okay, maybe we should have just gotten rid of him to start the season, but luckily it's still only week 3 or week 4, right? And we can make that change now. We can call that guy that we had in camp. We can call, someone else that lost a kicking competition in camp this season, and we can bring someone in and we can really like nail this down and, best of luck. You were great for, 5-6 years with the Falcons, right? But I think that I personally would probably still bring him back and trust that this offseason he's going to get that motion right, and he's going to figure out how to kind of fine tune it, because again, like, it's a very drastic change that he made, right? And doing that on your own, not entirely, but essentially, right, on your own, and doing it in such a non-traditional way, right? That lends itself a lot to, this is a very early draft of what this motion probably should look like, right? And so I think that if you're the Falcons, you may not have the patience to wait for that for 2, 3, 4 years, right? But if he's able to get it right this offseason, then I think that there's a lot of value in bringing a guy like Younghoe Koo back, because again, he has been one of the better kickers in the NFL for 5, 6, 7 years at this point.
Absolutely. So, Alex, I appreciate your insight into this. And with you saying they should bring back Younghoe Koo, I will just defer to you and say, well, he said that they should bring back Younghoe Koo, and you can't really argue with Alex on, because he is the internet's kicking guru. So clearly, he has the correct opinion on this. But let the people know if they want to get more insights into, when it comes to special teams mattering, as well as some of the other things that you're working on, especially with the combine coming ahead.
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the top, I'm kind of anywhere and everywhere these days. My writing is kind of scattered all over the place. I mostly cover the Chargers. I cover the Chargers for Chargers Wire over on USA Today. I also write about the Washington Huskies. But to find everything that I'm doing, the easiest place to go is probably my new website, alexkatson.com. That has links to all of my best work, as well as all of the places that I currently make content, including Chargers Wire, Huskies Wire, my Substack that I run with Devin Jackson about the NFL draft, my YouTube channel that I work on doing Chargers draft videos. Everything is all there. My Patreon with all the spreadsheet work that I do, all of that is there. And so that's probably the easiest place to find me these days.
There you go. Well, Alex, I look forward to future conversations potentially with you, whether it's about Younghoe Koo, maybe some draft prospects. So we'd love to get you back on the podcast at some point in the coming weeks and or months to talk more things about this upcoming draft class, as well as, talking about kickers and whatnot. So, appreciate you for coming on today to talk about Younghoe Koo.
Appreciate you for having me.
So I want to thank Alex Katson for joining me on today's episode and giving me his insights. Again, you guys didn't think we could do a deep dive in kicker, and it couldn't be as compelling an episode as we thought it was. But this episode is not over, right? I'll give my thoughts on this particular issue and talk about the pros and cons of keeping Younghoe Koo or cutting him to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So now, guys, we've talked with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. We've talked with Josh Kindle of The Athletic. Now we've talked with Alex Katson of so many entities about, whether or not, the Falcons should keep or cut Koo. And we run the gamut, right? Jarvis is definitely on the bye Felicia side of things. Josh is basically, he could see it go either way. And Alex is clearly, as he indicated, on the camp of keeping him and seeing what's what. And I think I spoiled it earlier in the episode, but I'm on Alex's side on this one. I don't think you necessarily throw away one of the best kickers in the league off of one down year. As Alex said, I feel like, this is not unheard of with kickers to have a down year and then they kind of bounce back. And I also don't think Koo's struggles were nearly as egregious as a lot of people said them to be. I think when you contextualize his stats from this past season, as I did a couple of times in season, it's not nearly as terrible a season as people like to believe. Like, Koo historically has hit 89.9% of his field goals in Atlanta in the 5 previous seasons going into 2024. If, on 34 attempts that he had in 2024, the expectation then would be that he would make about 30.5 of those field goals. He made 25. So you would say, okay, he was 5.5 field goals below expectation, but 2 of those field goals were blocked this past year, which I think is a part of the conversation that gets lost because people just sort of chuck it up as all these are like Younghoe Koo's fault. And it's like, no, clearly guys blew the protections. And I thought it was funny seeing, that viral clip from Keith Armstrong from Hard Knocks in 2014, where he was just eviscerating Rashid Hageman and Malachi Goodman for blown protections on those field goals. And I know Keith Armstrong is somewhere rolling in his grave, and I know he's alive, but I like saying, that. But Keith Armstrong would not stand for that. Marquise Williams, not as much of a firebrand that's going to rip players like Keith Armstrong would, but certainly Keith Armstrong, I'm sure, would have something to say about two of those missed kicks from Younghoe Koo this past season. But Koo in the 5 previous years, by the way, for those of you curious, only had 1 blocked field goal on 168 field goal attempts. And this year he had 2 out of 34. And you do the math on that, that's a 10-fold increase of going from 0.6% of his field goals being blocked in 5 years to this past year, 6%. And again, that's part of this conversation. So to me, instead of him being 5.5 kicks below expectation, to me, it's really 3.5 kicks below expectation. Right? Or 3 or 4, depending on how you want to lean on your math and whatnot. And so, as I said, during the season, that basically boils down to like 1 bad game, that second Saints game where he missed 2 field goals and had a third one blocked and whatnot. And, I said that during the season when that number was a little bit lower, then he had the 2 missed kicks late in the season after the bye week against the Chargers and the Raiders from 35 and 42. And I think a lot of that is owed to what Alex was talking about with the injury sort of, catching up to him and causing him to miss, short kicks that he generally had been automatic on throughout his career. And so, again, I think throwing away one of the best kickers in the NFL because he's 3 or 4 kicks below expectation, to me seems like an overreaction. But I think for all the reasons already discussed on the pod, I think there are plenty of reasons to think that he's going to bounce back from that quote unquote down year where, again, we're talking about 3 or 4 missed kicks. Now, I think the case for moving on from Koo is really about money. And it's really about what Jarvis said a couple of weeks ago, where if Koo doesn't rebound, are you going to be sitting here wondering in 8 months or so from now being like, man, we could have cut him sooner rather than, later. Right. And you look back at how Koo's own career kind of began here in Atlanta, going back to that 2018 season where longtime Falcons kicker Matt Bryant, Falcons legendary kicker Matt Bryant, got hurt for a couple of games. The Falcons brought in Giorgio Tavecchio for a couple of games. He played well, hitting a game winner against the Giants, I recall. And basically the Falcons were like, okay, well, Matt Bryant's like 40 plus. This is our off-ramp to Matt Bryant, so we're going to move on to Giorgio Tavecchio and move off of Matt Bryant the following offseason. I personally was not a fan of that move at the time. I felt like trusting Italian Ice, who Giorgio Tavecchio's nickname based off of 2 or 3 games, was not a good plan, right? The Falcons went all in on Tavecchio, did not bring in any competition. He struggled during that summer. They wound up cutting him, bringing Matt Bryant back. Matt Bryant struggled. And then the Falcons scooped up this kicker from the AAF named Younghoe Koo, and the rest of the story. And, because Raheem Morris was around for that, you do wonder if they're going to be a little bit more reluctant to move off of Koo like this team was willing to move off of Bryant, 7 years ago. Or 6 years ago, I guess it was. Now, when it comes to the money conversation, the $3 million the Falcons are saving with cutting Koo isn't a significant amount. But, when you look at his cap hit of $5.5 million, given his struggles this past year, that feels like way too much for a quote unquote questionable kicker. That's the 7th highest cap hit currently heading into the 2025 season. You could cut him, save $3 million, take on the $2.5 million dead money hit, and you could sign someone else for the veteran minimum around like $1 million. And in theory, you could get a comparable return to what you're expecting from Younghoe Koo for about half the price. That's really the case for cutting Koo in that regard. And if you, sort of erase the Riley Patterson saga from your memory, where the Falcons tried to find a replacement for Younghoe Koo or an injury fill-in for Younghoe Koo, and Patterson struggled in that role. But in theory, Riley Patterson withstanding, it should be theoretically easier for the Falcons to find a capable replacement kicker than pretty much any other team, because Mercedes-Benz Stadium is such a kicker-friendly stadium. I looked at the other 10 indoor stadiums, 11 teams that play in them due to LA having 2 teams playing in the same stadium at SoFi, and looked at how accurate opposing kickers are in those stadiums, as well as home team kickers since 2017 when MBS was built here in Atlanta. And then for the Raiders and the Rams and Chargers stadiums, since 2020, those stadiums were built. But for the rest, since 2017. And of those indoor stadiums, Mercedes-Benz Stadium has the highest rate of field goal accuracy for opposing kickers, about 93% field goal accuracy. There are 6 on that list in terms of home kicking, 87%, but you combine those two figures together, and this is the most kicker-friendly stadium, just slightly edging out the Chargers with 80, the Falcons, 89.9% field goal accuracy overall. Chargers were 89.8%. The Rams, by the way, in the same stadium, the Chargers 88.1%. But the Cowboys over at AT&T Stadium were number 3 on that with 89.7%. So, basically those are the 3 most kicker-friendly stadiums, SoFi, MBS, and AT&T Stadium. And then when you look at the Cowboys, you're looking at some of them, maybe some of you guys are looking at them a little envious because they were able to scoop up a guy named Brandon Aubrey, 2 years ago from the USFL, similar to how the Falcons were able to scoop up Koo in 2019 from the AAF. And Aubrey's been a very, very effective kicker these last couple of years. You see the Lions scooping up Jake Bates from the UFL last spring. And he went on to have a pretty successful year in Detroit this past year. And so you can look at that and say, hey, man, with the spring football, UFL coming back this year, maybe we could scoop up one of those guys and maybe get our Brandon Aubrey, our Jake Bates, our new version of Younghoe Koo for a significantly lower price. Now, I do think that is a path to bring in the potential competition for Younghoe Koo as opposed to outright replacing him. But obviously, if the Falcons are going to look to replace him, that's probably the most worn path and the most successful path. I don't think drafting a kicker should really be in the consideration. The hit rate on drafted kickers is so low. That's what I was getting at with Alex at the beginning of our conversation, talking about how NFL teams haven't figured this out, because you look at basically half the kickers that are drafted in the NFL are with a new team going into their second or third NFL season, right? The chances of those guys making it to the end of the rookie contract compared to other positions seems to be so much lower than any other position. And so to me, it does make a ton of sense to draft guys that have such a low hit rate of being successful with your team, just based off of just lasting 4 years on your roster, right? Now, I think there's a reason for that, because we've mentioned before, like kickers are like quarterbacks, where it takes some time for those guys to develop. The prime of a kicker is around where Younghoe Koo is now, that 28 to 35-year-old range, right? And it takes guys years to develop. And because of the high stakes of being a kicker in the NFL, the relatively short leashes that these guys have, many of these guys are not ready at 22, 23 years old coming out of college. Some are, but those guys are more rare than I think people realize. And so it's really, in my opinion, the smart strategy for NFL teams is to just kind of wait 3 to 5 years after these guys get some seasoning and scoop those guys up, like we did with Koo, who came into the league in 2017, but didn't really find his footing until 2019. But basically how I would handle it, guys, is I would restructure the Koo contract, get his cap hit down to about $3 million if you can tack on some void years on that, bring in some competition potentially from the UFL or somebody else that's kind of been bouncing around for the last couple of years that is sort of ready to go, rather than trusting in some rookie or some UDFA. Get me a guy again with more seasoning, have that competition going into the summer. If Koo wins it and bounces back, then you have a conversation next offseason about maybe revamping that deal, maybe not paying him quite the premium or whatever, depending on what happens this upcoming season. If Koo struggles for whatever reason, you have that sort of plan B. You have that off-ramp potentially already on the team. You cut him, you take about $1.1 million in dead money this year, so you still save about $1 million by cutting him at the end of camp or sometime during the season. You would take on about $3.7 million in dead money in 2026. This is after this void year restructure that I'm talking about, which is a lot for a kicker, but it's still about $2 million in savings from what his 2026 cap hit was going to be before we revamped and reworked this contract, which is about $5.75 million. So to me, I think where the upside is for the Falcons is keeping Koo and hoping he rebounds, not necessarily trying to replace him. To me, you have so many other issues on defense that, creating a hole at kicker isn't necessarily the smartest use of resources, but I can understand the desire to want to save some money, and pinching pennies at, $3 million in savings totally makes sense. So we'll see what the Falcons do. I understand it both ways. I know some of you guys struggle when it seems like I'm hedging. I'm playing both sides, so I can always come out on top. But it is one of those things where when you look at a lot of these issues, when it comes to keeping or cutting guys, whether we're talking about Grady Jarrett, whether we're talking about Younghoe Koo and others, it's not as black and white as I think a lot of people portray. And so like the Falcons, I would understand it if the Falcons, similar to what Josh Kendall said, if they moved on from Younghoe Koo. I wouldn't agree with it, but I wouldn't sit here and be like, that's a terrible decision. Just like I wouldn't sit here and tell you like, oh, clearly the right decision is keeping Younghoe Koo and he's guaranteed to be successful and there's no risk involved in keeping him. It's a lot more shades of gray in that. And that's one of the reasons why we do these conversations, so that you guys can understand, okay, well, the Falcons are going in this direction. They could have easily gone in another direction. But breaking down those shades of gray and whatnot on this podcast. So, I do expect them ultimately to keep Koo and guys like Grady Jarrett, but there is a chance that the Falcons do decide to move on from one or more of those guys this offseason as they look to revamp this roster. I would be mildly surprised, basically. I wouldn't be totally shocked, like I can't believe the Falcons did this, but it is just more just like their normal, the way that they operate typically would be keeping those guys and trying one more shot at those guys, having the types of seasons that they're hoping to have in 2025 with, all hands on deck this year. And so I think both of those guys, because of their long-term contributions for this football team, I think, I'm sure other people disagree, but I think they kind of owe it and they kind of deserve the opportunity to have that chance to rebound this season if you see it that way. So we'll see what the Falcons wind up doing. Tomorrow's episode, we will probably be getting into whatever Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris, who will be speaking to the media on Tuesday morning at the Indianapolis Combine. We'll be talking about what those guys have to say. Usually they don't say a whole lot, so I'm not sure if that's going to be more than like 5 minutes of the podcast, but we'll see what's what. And then later this week, we'll get into sort of getting into the nitty gritty of, who needs to test well, who can, help their stock, hurt their stock, all that stuff with the testing later this week as well for the Combine. So, appreciate you guys for enduring, a full 30 plus minutes of kicking conversation, but special teams matters. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft show with Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez, getting you guys geared up for this week's Combine and so much more this offseason. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.